The conference room fell silent as I slid the acquisition papers across the mahogany table. My former boss, Marcus Crawford, stared at the documents with his mouth agape, his face draining of color as he realized what was happening. After 18 months of meticulous planning, I was about to own the company that had stolen my life's work. My name is Jessica Parker, and this is the story of how I turned corporate betrayal into the sweetest revenge imaginable. It all started 2 years ago when I was still naive enough to believe that hard work and innovation would be rewarded fairly. I was 28, fresh out of my PhD program in computational finance, and absolutely brilliant at what I did. Technova Financial had recruited me straight from Stanford with promises of creative freedom and substantial equity participation in any algorithms I developed. I should have read the fine print more carefully. For 18 months, I poured my soul into developing what would become known as the Aurora algorithm. It was a revolutionary approach to high-frequency trading that could predict market movements with 94% accuracy. The algorithm was my baby, born from countless sleepless nights, fueled by energy drinks and an obsession with perfecting every line of code. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember the exact moment because I had been debugging for 36 hours straight when suddenly, everything clicked. The algorithm wasn't just working, it was performing beyond my wildest expectations. In the first test run, it generated a theoretical profit of $2.3 million in a single trading session. I was ecstatic. This was it. This was going to change everything. I immediately scheduled a meeting with Marcus Crawford, Technova's CEO, and Patricia Blackwood, the head of development. I trusted them completely. After all, they had mentored me, supported my research, and repeatedly assured me that I would be the primary beneficiary of any successful innovations. The meeting took place in Marcus's corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown San Francisco. I presented my findings with the enthusiasm of someone who truly believed she was about to change the world. Marcus and Patricia listened intently, asking all the right questions, nodding at all the right moments. "This is incredible work, Jessica," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with something I mistook for pride. "The potential here is astronomical. We're talking about revolutionizing the entire industry." Patricia leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers steepled. "The algorithm could be worth tens of millions, maybe more. This could make Technova the dominant player in algorithmic trading." I felt a surge of pride and excitement. Finally, all my hard work was paying off. "We'll need to move quickly," Marcus continued. "The market for this kind of technology is incredibly competitive. I think we should fast-track this to production immediately." "What about the equity participation we discussed?" I asked, suddenly feeling a need to clarify the terms. "My contract specifies that I retain primary ownership of any algorithms I develop." Marcus and Patricia exchanged a look that I should have recognized as a warning sign. Instead, I interpreted it as professional consideration. "Of course," Marcus said smoothly. "We'll have legal draw up all the paperwork. In the meantime, I need you to transfer all your research, code, and documentation to our secure servers. We can't risk having this kind of intellectual property sitting on personal devices." It made sense. I complied immediately, uploading everything to Technova's internal systems. Every line of code, every research note, every test result. I even included my personal development journals, thinking they might be useful for future iterations. That was my first mistake. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and presentations. I was asked to explain the algorithm to various department heads, to walk through the code with the development team, and to provide detailed documentation of my methodology. Each time, I was assured that this was standard procedure for major innovations. Then came the Friday that changed everything. I arrived at the office to find my access card had been deactivated, confused. I called Marcus's assistant, who told me there had been a system glitch and that IT would sort it out. I waited in the lobby for 20 minutes before Marcus himself came down to meet me. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said, his tone completely different from the warm mentor I thought I knew. "Let's go to Conference Room B." Conference Room B was where they held disciplinary meetings. Inside, Patricia was waiting with Harold Steinberg. Technova's head of legal. The atmosphere was glacial. Jessica, Marcus began, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. We've been reviewing your employment contract and your recent work on the trading algorithm. My stomach dropped. I knew, even before he continued, that something was terribly wrong. It's come to our attention that your algorithm incorporates proprietary methodologies and data structures that belong to Technova, Patricia said, her voice clinical and detached. Additionally, the contract you signed clearly states that any work performed using company resources becomes company property. Harold slid a document across the table. It was my employment contract, but with sections highlighted in yellow that I didn't remember seeing before. As you can see, Harold continued. Section 4.2 explicitly states that all intellectual property developed during your employment using company time, resources, or equipment belongs solely to Technova Financial. I stared at the contract, my mind racing. This wasn't what I had signed. I was certain of it. But as I read through the highlighted sections, I realized how thoroughly I had been outmaneuvered. This isn't what we agreed on, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You promised me equity participation. You said I would retain ownership of my innovations. Marcus's expression didn't change. I'm afraid there's no record of any such agreement. Your compensation package was clearly outlined in your contract, including a competitive salary and standard benefits. There was never any mention of equity participation in intellectual property. But I have emails, I protested. I have records of our conversations. Company emails, Patricia pointed out, on company servers, which, as outlined in your contract, belong to Technova and can be accessed or modified as needed for business purposes. The room was spinning. I felt like I was drowning in corporate quicksand. Furthermore, Harold continued, we've identified several instances where you've violated your non-disclosure agreement by discussing proprietary information with external parties. This constitutes a serious breach of your employment terms. I never discussed anything with anyone outside the company, I said, my voice rising in desperation. Our investigation shows otherwise, Marcus said coldly. You've been in communication with several competitors, including Quantum Analytics and Alpha Financial. These communications suggest you were shopping around our proprietary information. I knew this was a lie. I had never communicated with any competitors, but as I looked around the room, I realized that the truth was irrelevant. They had decided to steal my work, and they had constructed an elaborate justification for doing so. Effective immediately, Marcus continued. Your employment with Technova is terminated. You'll be escorted from the building by security, and your final paycheck will be processed according to company policy. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what was happening. 2 years of my life, my most important work, my future. All of it was being stolen in a sterile conference room by people I had trusted. I'll sue, I said finally. I'll take this to court. I'll expose what you've done. Marcus smiled, and it was the coldest expression I had ever seen. Jessica, you're welcome to try, but you might want to consider the costs involved. Litigation against a company like Technova could bankrupt you. And given the evidence of your contractual violations, you'd be lucky to avoid criminal charges. Patricia leaned forward. We're being generous by offering you a clean termination. I suggest you take it and move on with your life. Harold slid another document across the table. This is a non-disclosure agreement regarding your employment here. Sign it, and we'll provide you with a modest severance package. Refuse, and you'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. I looked at the NDA. It was comprehensive, preventing me from discussing my work, my termination, or any aspect of my employment with Technova. It would effectively silence me forever. But I was trapped. I had no money for legal fees, no evidence that wouldn't be dismissed as hearsay, and no allies within the company. I signed the document with shaking hands. 20 minutes later, I was standing on the sidewalk outside Technova's gleaming headquarters, carrying a small box of personal items and feeling like my world had ended. I had been systematically betrayed, robbed, and discarded. That was when I decided that Marcus Crawford and Patricia Blackwood were going to pay for what they had done. The first few weeks after my termination were the darkest of my life. I spent my days in my tiny apartment, alternating between rage and despair. I had some savings, but not enough to last more than a few months. I was effectively blacklisted from the financial technology industry. Technova had made sure of that by spreading rumors about my ethical violations and unreliable behavior. But gradually, the despair began to transform into something more useful: cold, calculating anger. I started researching everything I could about Technova, Marcus, and Patricia. I studied their business practices, their financial statements, their corporate structure. I learned about their investors, their competitors, their weaknesses. I became obsessed with understanding exactly how they operated. More importantly, I began to understand how I could destroy them. The Aurora algorithm was being fast-tracked to production, just as Marcus had promised. Within 3 months of my termination, Technova announced a breakthrough in algorithmic trading that would revolutionize the industry. They didn't mention my name, of course. Instead, they credited their innovative development team, led by Patricia Blackwood. The algorithm was everything I had designed it to be. Technova's trading profits skyrocketed. Their stock price doubled. Marcus and Patricia were featured on the covers of financial magazines as visionary leaders in the new era of algorithmic trading. And I was forgotten. But I had one advantage that they didn't know about. I had built a backdoor into the Aurora algorithm. During my development process, I had included a hidden subroutine that would allow me to monitor the algorithm's performance and make adjustments if necessary. It was a standard practice in algorithmic development, and I had never mentioned it to anyone at Technova. As far as they knew, the algorithm was a black box that simply worked. But I could see everything. I could see how many trades it was making, how much money it was generating, and most importantly, I could see its vulnerability points. The algorithm was powerful, but it had been designed with certain assumptions about market conditions. If those conditions changed in specific ways, the algorithm could be manipulated. I began to formulate a plan. The first step was to build my own resources. I couldn't take on Technova without significant financial backing, so I needed to find investors who were willing to bet on my vision of revenge. I started by reaching out to some contacts I had made during my PhD program. One of them, Dr. Michael Torres, had left academia to start a venture capital firm focused on financial technology. I arranged a meeting with him, carefully avoiding any mention of my work at Technova. I have an idea for a new kind of trading algorithm, I told him over coffee in a downtown cafe. Something that could outperform anything currently on the market. Michael was intrigued. What makes you think you can beat the established players? Companies like Technova have been dominating this space for years. I smiled. Because I know their weaknesses better than they do. Over the next few weeks, I developed a business plan for what I called Phoenix Financial. The concept was simple: create a trading algorithm that could not only compete with the Aurora algorithm, but actively exploit its vulnerabilities. I called my new creation the Nemesis algorithm. The Nemesis algorithm was designed to be Aurora's perfect predator. It would monitor Aurora's trading patterns, predict its moves, and execute counter strategies that would gradually erode its effectiveness. It was financial warfare at its most sophisticated. Michael was impressed enough to introduce me to his network of investors. Within 2 months, I had raised $5 million in seed funding. 6 months later, I had raised an additional $15 million in Series A funding. Phoenix Financial was born. I rented a small office in downtown San Francisco, just a few blocks from Technova's headquarters. Every morning, I would walk past their building on my way to work, a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. I hired a small team of brilliant developers, most of them recent graduates who were hungry and willing to work for equity. I was careful not to hire anyone who had connections to Technova or might be tempted to share information about our work. The development of the Nemesis algorithm took 8 months. It was the most complex piece of software I'd ever created. requiring not just financial expertise, but also advanced game theory and predictive modeling. The algorithm had to be smart enough to learn Aurora's patterns without being detected, and aggressive enough to exploit them effectively. During this time, I monitored Technova's performance obsessively. The Aurora algorithm was making them enormous profits, but I could see signs of complacency. They weren't updating the algorithm's parameters or adjusting for changing market conditions. They were coasting on my innovation, believing themselves to be untouchable. That was going to be their downfall. The first test of the Nemesis algorithm came in March, almost exactly a year after my termination from Technova. I started with a small deployment, just $500,000, in trading capital, to see how the algorithm would perform against Aurora in real market conditions. The results were better than I had dared to hope. Nemesis didn't just compete with Aurora, it actively hunted it. Every time Aurora executed a large trade, Nemesis would anticipate the move and position itself to profit from the resulting market movements. It was like watching a chess grandmaster play against a computer that could predict every move. Within a month, Phoenix Financial had generated $2.1 million in profits. More importantly, Technova's trading performance had begun to decline. Aurora was still profitable, but its efficiency was dropping as Nemesis continued to exploit its predictable patterns. I increased the deployment to $2 million, then $5 million, then $10 million. Each time, the results were the same. Phoenix Financial's profits increased while Technova's performance declined. Marcus and Patricia were beginning to notice. I knew this because I had cultivated a network of contacts within the financial industry who kept me informed about Technova's internal discussions. They were puzzled by Aurora's declining performance and increasingly paranoid about new competitors. Someone out there has developed something that's specifically designed to counter our algorithm. I heard Patricia had said during a board meeting, "We need to find out who it is and how they're doing it." But they were looking in the wrong places. They assumed their competition was coming from one of the established players in the market, Quantum Analytics, Alpha Financial, or one of the big investment banks. They never suspected that a tiny startup run by their former employee was systematically dismantling their flagship product. By month 6 of the Nemesis deployment, Phoenix Financial had generated over $30 million in profits. We had grown from a team of 5 to a team of 20, and I was fielding calls from major investors who wanted to pour money into our operation. More importantly, Technova was in crisis. Aurora's performance had declined by 40% from its peak. The algorithm was still profitable, but it was no longer the revolutionary money-making machine that had driven Technova's recent success. Their stock price had dropped by 25%, and there were rumors that several major clients were considering switching to other providers. Marcus was under pressure from the board to explain what was happening. Patricia had been tasked with developing a new version of Aurora that could compete with the mysterious new player in the market. But they were fighting a war they couldn't win because they didn't understand the battlefield. The Nemesis algorithm had evolved beyond my original design. It was now using machine learning to adapt to Aurora's attempts at modification, staying one step ahead of any changes Technova tried to implement. It was like watching a computer virus that could rewrite itself to avoid detection. By month 8, I was ready for the next phase of my plan. I had been quietly acquiring Technova stock through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. The declining stock price had made it relatively affordable, and I had been building a significant position without triggering any disclosure requirements. At the same time, I had been investigating Technova's financial structure. I discovered that the company had taken on substantial debt to fund its expansion, confident that Aurora's profits would continue indefinitely. They had also made several risky investments in other financial technology companies, further leveraging their position. Technova was more vulnerable than they appeared. I began to increase the pressure. I deployed more capital through the Nemesis algorithm, targeting not just Aurora but also Technova's other trading strategies. I used my industry contacts to spread rumors about Technova's declining performance and management problems. Most importantly, I began to approach Technova's major clients with a proposition. Phoenix Financial could provide them with superior trading algorithms at competitive prices. Several clients, frustrated with Aurora's declining performance, were willing to listen. Within 2 months, Phoenix Financial had poached 3 of Technova's largest clients, representing over $100 million in assets under management. The exodus sent Technova's stock price into free fall. Marcus called an emergency board meeting. According to my sources, he was furious and desperate, demanding that the company's resources be focused on identifying and neutralizing the threat to their business. "Someone is systematically destroying us," he reportedly said. "This isn't just competition, this is warfare. We need to find out who's behind Phoenix Financial and shut them down." But it was too late. By month 12, Technova's stock price had dropped by 60% from its peak. The company was facing margin calls on its debt, and several investors were demanding management changes. Aurora's performance had declined to the point where it was barely profitable. Phoenix Financial, meanwhile, had grown into a $200 million company with over 50 employees. We had expanded beyond algorithmic trading into other areas of financial technology, always staying one step ahead of our competition. I had also been building relationships with Technova's investors and board members. I presented myself as a successful entrepreneur who was interested in the financial technology sector. I attended the same conferences, joined the same clubs, and gradually became a familiar face in their circles. None of them knew that I was the architect of Technova's downfall. The final phase of my plan began in month 15. I had been quietly coordinating with a group of institutional investors who were frustrated with Technova's performance and management. I offered them a solution: a hostile takeover of Technova, led by Phoenix Financial, with the goal of restructuring the company and returning it to profitability. The investors were interested. Technova's stock price had dropped to the point where an acquisition was feasible, and Phoenix Financial's track record made me a credible leader for a turnaround effort. I spent 3 months assembling the acquisition team, securing financing, and preparing the legal groundwork. The plan was to acquire a controlling stake in Technova through a combination of stock purchases and proxy battles, then replace the management team and integrate Technova's remaining assets into Phoenix Financial. It was going to be the most satisfying moment of my life. The acquisition announcement came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 18 months after my termination from Technova. Phoenix Financial, backed by a consortium of investors, was making a hostile takeover bid for Technova Financial at $12 per share, a 40% premium over the current stock price. The news sent shockwaves through the financial industry. Technova had been a market leader just 18 months earlier, and now it was being acquired by a company that most people had never heard of. Marcus called an emergency press conference to denounce the acquisition as financial terrorism by opportunistic vultures. He promised to fight the takeover and protect Technova's employees and shareholders. But the writing was on the wall. Technova's board, under pressure from institutional investors who had lost millions on their investment, was ready to accept the buyout offer. The company's debt obligations made it impossible to continue operating independently, and Phoenix Financial's offer represented the best available option for shareholders. The acquisition process took 6 weeks. During that time, I maintained my public persona as a successful entrepreneur interested in expanding Phoenix Financial's capabilities. I gave interviews to financial publications, attended industry conferences, and presented myself as a visionary leader who could turn Technova around. Marcus and Patricia fought the acquisition every step of the way. They hired expensive lawyers, launched a public relations campaign, and even attempted to find a white knight buyer who would make a competing offer. But their efforts were futile. Phoenix Financial's bid was too attractive, and Technova's position was too weak. The final board meeting was held on a Friday afternoon in October. The vote was unanimous. Technova would be acquired by Phoenix Financial for $12 per share, representing a total transaction value of $400 million. I owned Technova. The transition meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I had been looking forward to this moment for 18 months, and I wanted to savor every second of it. I arrived at Technova's headquarters at 9 a.m. sharp, accompanied by my acquisition team and a phalanx of lawyers. The building looked exactly the same as it had when I was escorted out 18 months earlier. But now I was walking in as the owner. Marcus and Patricia were waiting in the same conference room where they had terminated me. The irony was not lost on any of us. "Jessica," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "Congratulations on your successful acquisition. I have to admit, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished with Phoenix Financial." I smiled and took a seat at the head of the table. "Thank you. Marcus, it's been quite a journey." Patricia was staring at me with a mixture of shock and dawning recognition. "Phoenix Financial," she said slowly. "The company that's been targeting our algorithms, that was you." "Very perceptive," I replied. "Though it took you a bit longer to figure it out than I expected." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Marcus's face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale, sickly color. "You planned this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The whole thing. Phoenix Financial, the algorithm attacks, the client defections. You orchestrated our downfall." "I prefer to think of it as justice," I said calmly. "You stole my work, destroyed my career, and tried to erase me from the industry. I simply returned the favor." I slid a folder across the table. "These are the termination agreements for both of you. You'll find the terms quite generous, considering the circumstances. 6 months of severance pay, full benefits continuation, and a non-disclosure agreement that will prevent you from discussing your employment here or the circumstances of your departure." Marcus opened the folder with shaking hands. "This is exactly what you did to me," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "I thought you might appreciate the symmetry." Patricia was still staring at me in disbelief. "How did you do it? How did you build Phoenix Financial so quickly? How did you know how to attack Aurora?" I leaned back in my chair. "You made several critical errors. First, you underestimated me. You thought that terminating me would be the end of the story. Second, you never bothered to fully understand the algorithm you stole. Aurora was my creation, and I knew its weaknesses better than anyone. Third, you became complacent. You thought you were untouchable because you had stolen something brilliant, but brilliant ideas are worthless without the ability to evolve and improve them." I paused, enjoying the expressions on their faces. "And finally, you forgot the most important rule of corporate warfare. Never make an enemy of someone who has nothing left to lose." The meeting continued for another hour as we worked through the details of the transition. Marcus and Patricia would leave immediately. Along with most of Technova's senior management, the Aurora algorithm would be retired, replaced by more advanced systems developed by Phoenix Financial. The company would be restructured and integrated into Phoenix Financial's operations. By the end of the meeting, I controlled a combined enterprise worth over $600 million. I had destroyed the people who had wronged me and built something far greater than anything they had ever imagined. As Marcus and Patricia gathered their belongings to leave, I couldn't resist one final comment. "You know," I said, "if you had simply honored our original agreement and given me the equity participation you promised, none of this would have been necessary. I would have been content to make you both rich while building something revolutionary together." Marcus paused at the door. "Would you really have been satisfied with that?" I considered the question for a moment. "Probably not," I admitted. "But you'll never know for sure, will you?" The aftermath of the acquisition was everything I had hoped for, and more. The financial press hailed the Technova takeover as one of the most brilliant strategic moves in recent memory. I was featured on the cover of Fortune magazine as the architect of the perfect revenge. Phoenix Financial continued to grow and evolve. We developed new algorithms that made Aurora look primitive by comparison. We expanded into new markets and acquired other companies. Within 2 years, we had become one of the dominant players in the financial technology industry. Marcus and Patricia largely disappeared from the public eye after their termination. Marcus attempted to start a new company, but was unable to secure funding, partly due to whispers about his role in Technova's downfall. Patricia took a position with a mid-tier financial firm. a significant step down from her previous role. I occasionally heard rumors about them through industry contacts, but I found that I no longer cared about their fate. My revenge was complete, and I had moved on to building something far more important than their destruction: the Aurora algorithm. The piece of code that had started this entire saga was officially retired 6 months after the acquisition. I held a small ceremony in the conference room where I had been terminated, symbolically deleting the last traces of the algorithm from Phoenix Financial's systems. It was a fitting end to a chapter that had defined 2 years of my life. But the story doesn't end there. 3 years after the acquisition, Phoenix Financial went public in one of the largest IPOs in financial technology history. The company was valued at $2.8 billion, making me one of the youngest billionaires in the industry. During the IPO roadshow, I was frequently asked about the inspiration for Phoenix Financial's success. I would always give the same answer. Sometimes the best motivation is proving that your former employers made a terrible mistake. The financial press loved the story. They portrayed me as a brilliant entrepreneur who had overcome adversity to build something extraordinary. They called it an inspiring tale of innovation and perseverance. They weren't wrong, but they weren't telling the whole story either. The whole story was about revenge, pure and simple. It was about taking the worst thing that had ever happened to me and transforming it into the foundation of something greater. It was about proving that betrayal and theft could be turned into fuel for extraordinary success. Most importantly, it was about justice. Marcus and Patricia had stolen my work, destroyed my career, and tried to erase me from the industry. They had done it because they could, because they had power and I didn't, because they thought there would be no consequences. They were wrong. I had shown them that talent, determination, and the desire for justice could overcome any corporate conspiracy. I had proven that stealing someone's work might provide short-term gains, but it would ultimately lead to long-term destruction. The Aurora algorithm had been worth approximately $20 million when they stole it from me. By the time I finished my revenge, I had built a company worth $2.8 billion and destroyed the careers of everyone who had wronged me. It was the best return on investment I had ever achieved. Today, Phoenix Financial continues to dominate the financial technology industry. We employ over 500 people and manage assets worth more than $50 billion. Our algorithms are used by major investment banks, hedge funds, and institutional investors around the world. The company is my legacy, but it's also my reminder. Every day when I walk into the office, I remember what it felt like to be powerless, betrayed, and dismissed. I remember the rage and desperation I felt when I realized that my life's work had been stolen. But I also remember the satisfaction of watching Marcus and Patricia's faces when they realized what I had done. I remember the moment when they understood that their victim had become their destroyer. That memory sustains me through every challenge and drives me to continue building something extraordinary. Because revenge, when executed perfectly, isn't just about destroying your enemies. It's about proving that they never should have underestimated you in the first place. The conference room where it all began is now my office. I kept the same mahogany table, the same leather chairs, even the same artwork on the walls. But I added one new element, a small plaque on the wall that reads, "Justice delayed is not justice denied." It's a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough to make your enemies regret their choices. And in that regard, I have succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Marcus Crawford and Patricia Blackwood thought they could steal my future and get away with it. Instead, they gave me the motivation to build something far greater than anything they could have imagined. They stole my $20 million algorithm. 18 months later, I bought out their entire company. And that, as they say, is how you turn betrayal into the sweetest revenge imaginable.